This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and this year, as I continue to move forward in the work that I do in classical education, I'm going to be devoting more and more time to the study and discussion of natural philosophy. And the reason why is because I really believe that it can be proven that modern science and the effect that modern science has on our minds and on our lives in every area of our lives is destructive and is a cause of many of the troubles that we falsely blame on other sources. And as we get into discussions on natural philosophy, I'd like to try and show what I mean by that and how the problems that exist in modern thinking and modern life, and I'm talking about modern thinking and life among Catholic people. I'm not talking about people who are lost in the world. Obviously, they have problems, but I'm talking about Catholic people who, because they have not received the education that was considered normal throughout Catholic history, and they have not lived within a system of life that was considered normal throughout Christian history, they live in a constant state of confusion where the principles of their Catholic life conflict with the principles of every other area of their lives. And so in this talk, what I'd like to do is introduce you, whoever's listening, to some of the starting points for this consideration. And I'd like to focus on a few events, really one significant event that took place in the 17th century, where we can really see the source of the changes in thought and life that have led to what we're used to in modern society, but which didn't exist before the 17th century. Now, in Catholic circles, most Catholics are aware of the Protestant Reformation. Most Catholics know what Protestants think, what they believe, what they teach. Most Catholics know the criticisms that Protestants raise against Catholics. And if you're even decently catechized, you can answer most criticisms and objections from Protestants. And the most important point that Catholics need to be grounded in is simply the authority of the papacy, the authority of the hierarchy of the church. That is the essential doctrine of the true Christian faith. If we look at the book of Acts, we see that Jesus established a visible earthly church with chosen living leaders, and that those leaders passed their authority on to chosen successors, and they did this by physically laying hands on them as a sign of that perpetual, visible authority. That's the non-negotiable truth that separates Catholics from non-Catholics. And you've got to make that the pillar of your faith as a Catholic. You believe in the Catholic Church. You believe in the papacy. You believe in the authority of the hierarchy of the church, the magisterium. Most Catholics have a sense of that foundation and can resist the arguments that come from Protestants, and they're conscious that in the 15 and 1600s there was a revolution within Christian circles where there was a giant schism in the church led by men like Martin Luther and John Calvin and other Protestant leaders, King Henry VIII in England and so on. And the church was divided, and a great number of Christians separated themselves from the papacy, from the hierarchy of the church, from the succession of the apostles, and formed a separate, and now many separate divisions of Christian life that were all founded on false beliefs and false teachings that were condemned by the church, not only at the time of that revolution, but throughout church history. And most Catholics know that there was a revolution in religion in the 15 and 1600s. And this is what we refer to as Protestantism. However, that was one of two significant revolutions at that time. And the other revolution, Catholics are not as conscious of it. And this is where modern Catholic thinking gets into trouble. And this is the source of a lot of the confusion among modern Catholics. Again, they're aware of the Protestant Revolution, which is really how we should refer to it. It wasn't a reformation in any sense. It was a revolution. Catholics are conscious and they know quite a bit about the Protestant Revolution, but what they don't know about is the scientific revolution. And this, I would argue, is even more important, even more dangerous, because it attacks the foundational principles of the Christian religion in a diabolical, cunning way that's very difficult for Christians to discern and actively resist. And again, this is the cause, I would argue, of much of the trouble and confusion in modern Catholic society, the reason why Catholic culture has disappeared, why there are no religious vocations, why Catholic families and schools are struggling in this inexplicable confusion of modern society. It goes back to this second revolution, which is the scientific revolution. This revolution had its origins in the life of men like Galileo, not because Galileo was a man interested in studying the natural world. Good men have studied the natural world since the beginning of human history. There's nothing new or noble about men being interested in the study of the natural world. It's always been sought by wise men. But what Galileo represents is a reckless desire to establish theories in controversial questions and promote them as scientific facts before they have ever been demonstrated scientifically. And so in this spirit of modern science that's represented by men like Galileo, there is a spirit of disobedience to the hierarchy of the church. There's a spirit of rebellion, a spirit of revolution, just as there was a spirit of rebellion among the Protestants in ecclesiastical and theological questions, so there's also a spirit of revolution and rebellion in philosophical issues, in the scientific revolution. And when we look at Galileo, there was never anything wrong with Galileo's desire to study the natural world. There was never anything wrong with Galileo's interest in proposing theories as a part of the process of investigating questions in the natural world. Those were never a problem for Galileo in the church. The problem was that Galileo wanted to publish his theories as facts before they were demonstrated, when they were known to be controversial, when they were known to contradict the content of sacred scripture, when they were known to contradict the opinion of wise men and saints through history, and that contradict the judgment of the hierarchy of the church. That's the spirit of the scientific revolution. It's a spirit of revolution and rebellion against the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Now, while we can look at men like Galileo as examples of the scientists who were eager to rebel against the church, we have to look to a different person to understand the thinking and the source of the ideas from a philosophical perspective. And the man that we would focus on as the father of modern science and the scientific revolution would be Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon, if you look him up, you can do so on the internet. If you look up Francis Bacon, you'll see that he wrote a series of works that were together referred to as the Great Instauration. The Great Instauration. And what Francis Bacon proposed in rebellion against the established philosophy and judgment of the authorities in place in the 15 and 1600s was that men should undertake a completely new investigation of the natural world, ignore everything that had been taught in the past, and establish natural sciences based on new observations using new instruments with no reference to the authority of the Catholic Church, the teachings of ancient philosophers, the observations of ancient philosophers, and so on. It was to be a completely new creation of the natural sciences, and he called this the Great Instauration. Now, this is where most Catholics are ignorant, and they don't know about these things, because most Catholics living in the 21st century went to modern schools and were simply immersed in the education and in the culture that proceeds from this scientific revolution. They were never taught the history of the scientific revolution. They were never led in any critical examination of the scientific revolution. They were simply taught that at some point in the 16 or 1700s, there was an explosion of scientific learning. And this was all good, and the human race suddenly was transformed from being an ignorant, superstitious, backwards race of people into an intelligent, rational, experimenting, exploring race of people who actually wanted to know the truth. And this is taught to children in schools. And children are taught that everyone who lived before this period of time was ignorant and superstitious and just crazy. And the scientists who led this revolution and the scientists who live today are all honest and careful and unbiased, not superstitious. They're all heroic virtuous men. And this is the image that's taught to children in all schools today, Christian and non-Christian, Catholic and non-Catholic. This is what's taught about modern science since the scientific revolution. None of the issues are even discussed because the education the children receive doesn't introduce them to the studies which existed before the scientific revolution. And so this entire argument of modern schooling is an argument against the straw man, this misrepresentation of philosophy before this scientific revolution. And no one studies the works of Aristotle or the natural philosophy of Pliny or the writings of Theophrastus or the medical writings of Hippocrates or Galen. No one studies these things. No one studies the writings on medicine by Saint Hildegard. The ancients are simply characterized, mischaracterized, more like caricatured, as a bunch of crazy, superstitious, ignorant people. And scientists of the modern age are simply people who, if they want to know what's under a rock, they pick the rock up and look, as if no one ever did that in the past. And this straw man argument is simply taught to children. And they grow up thinking that people before the 1600s were crazy and modern people are smart. I can remember being in high school and being taught that at the time of Christopher Columbus, everyone believed that the earth was flat, and Christopher Columbus had the idea, being a modern man, that the world might be round and he could actually sail around the world. And that's what I was taught in school. Anyone who studies classical philosophy, anyone who studies Catholic philosophy through St. Thomas Aquinas, anyone who studies Pliny's natural history, any work from the ancients, from Plato on, knows that no one ever believed that the earth was flat. No one ever taught that the earth was flat. The famous astronomer Ptolemy never taught that the earth was flat. He taught that the earth was a sphere. And so we have these common, modern, false teachings about the ancients, and it's an entire brainwashing of modern students to really imagine that before the time of Francis Bacon, no one thought to examine the natural world with the senses. They just sat around imagining things and making decisions and statements based on some kind of ungrounded religious fears that directed all of their thinking. And it's simply a fantasy that's made up about ancient people. And no one studies the ancient writings, so these teachers are never held accountable. No one can hold them accountable because no one knows what was taught before. And the reason why no one knows what's taught before is because it's very complicated, because these were extraordinarily wise men and their writings are very difficult to even understand. The people who criticize and scoff at them have never studied them themselves. And if anyone wants to study them to accurately understand their teaching, he's going to have to choose to do so instead of modern science because there's no time for both. And so modern people simply limit their knowledge to the teachings of the modern writers, modern science textbooks, and so on. And this all started with Francis Bacon and the Great Instauration. Now we have to realize that when Francis Bacon proposed these ideas, he was right in the midst of the Protestant Reformation. He was a non-Catholic himself. And when we say non-Catholic at that time, we should really be clear and say anti-Catholic. He was an anti-Catholic Englishman who hated scholastic philosophy. He hated the followers of St. Thomas Aquinas who taught in the Catholic Church, who were called the schoolmen. He hated scholastic philosophy. He hated Catholic Church authority. And he saw science and scientific investigation as a means of slipping out from under the shadow of scholastic philosophy and the authority of the Church. He was an anti-Catholic man. These ideas were not innocently proposed by some saint. These were the ideas of an anti-Catholic who wanted to escape from the control of Catholic theology and scholastic philosophy. And what he proposed in the midst of the Protestant Revolution, what he proposed was to do so by arguing that we should simply start from scratch and start with blank sheets of paper and empty books and begin experimenting with our own senses, with instruments that we create to assist our senses, and simply rewrite human knowledge, completely ignoring everything that has ever been said or observed before. And this is the real nature of the scientific revolution. Francis Bacon separated the study of the natural world from Christian faith. And that may sound like something reasonable, since the natural world is sensible and faith really applies to things unseen. It sounds sensible to say that if we want to understand the natural world, we should make use of our senses and maybe reason. But the problem with our senses and even with reason is that where there's no physical evidence, there can be no knowledge. And therefore, the most important of all questions in the investigation of the natural world can't be pursued. And that knowledge is the origin of the natural world. Where did the natural world come from? Why was the natural world formed as it was formed? What is the end or purpose of the natural world? And in light of that, what is the end or purpose of every part, every different species, or even individual plant or animal in the natural world? How can we answer these questions, the most important questions, if we can never know the answer to the question of where did the world come from and what was the purpose for the world and everything in the world? And this is where the modern chaos begins. We know nothing of the origin or purpose, and therefore modern science becomes just an aimless, wandering, confused, and vain pursuit of scientific trivia that really has no use or purpose. And this is what we see in modern natural science. And this is why most modern natural scientist people are called agnostics, which means we can't know anything about the most important questions of the natural world. We can't know anything beyond what is capable of observation. Now, even that sounds nice. It sounds good to say, well, we just can't know. You know, if you ask me, where did elephants come from? And I say, I don't know. That sounds like an honest and reasonable response. If you don't know the answer, just say you don't know. But it's not a reasonable answer because we need to know. And if it's not possible for us to know based on our own observation or reason, then it is reasonable to expect that God would reveal that truth to us. It's reasonable to expect divine revelation. It's not reasonable to think that we simply cannot know the origin or purpose of any of the things that we see in the natural world. That's not reasonable. It's not probable to think like that. It's far more probable to think that the creator of the world would reveal the means by which they were formed and the purpose for which they were formed, and therefore this faith in revelation of this truth from our Creator is necessary for the right investigation of this natural world. Think about simple things like how Jesus in the Gospels can say something like, "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them." And then Jesus says, "Are you not worth much more than the birds?" Well, that's a controversial question because there's no way for us to know that scientifically. Scientifically, there's no way for us to know that a human being is actually more valuable than a bird because we don't know the end for which the natural world exists. For our Lord, it's very simple to say a human being is more valuable than a bird. But for an agnostic scientist who claims to only be able to speak about what he can observe, he can't make a judgment that a human being is worth more than a bird. And we see this wackiness in modern politics where, and I see people arguing about this all the time, we'll see NASA looking for a single bacteria on Mars at the expense of billions and billions of dollars. And if anything, even a hint of any existence of water or a single specimen of some organic substance would lead NASA to conclude that there was life on Mars, and yet a developing fetus in the womb of a human mother is said to not be a living creature and has no right to life. We see these glaring self-contradictions in modern science, and this is because they have no foundation. We see this ridiculousness, this absurdity in modern scientific thinking when it's time to answer a question about human happiness or the happiness of human society. We see that science can't help us, and science becomes a means of justifying craziness. Another argument that's raised in political circles is that the eggs of an endangered species like an eagle will be protected by law, so that if one kills or destroys the eggs of an eagle, he can be punished criminally by the law. And yet, at the same time, a person can kill a human fetus, and it's legal to do so. And we look at that and say, how can it be legal to kill a human fetus, but be illegal to kill an eagle's egg. Doesn't make any sense. And that's the kind of moral absurdity that this scientific revolution has produced by its materialist worldview, where it refuses to consider anything that can't be perceived by the senses. And again, that sounds like a reasonable idea. Hey, let's talk about the natural world, but let's only talk about what we can perceive with our senses. Let's not bring any religious ideas. Let's not bring any philosophical ideas into the discussion. Let's just rely on that sounds like a nice idea, but you can see the foolishness of it by the consequences. All the wackiness we see today in politics and law that's owed to, and not just politics and law, but also in religion, that's owed to the imbibing, the thoughtless acceptance of the ideas of the scientific revolution. And this is the confusion that modern Catholics live in. It just seems like different parts of their lives, different areas of their lives can't be reconciled. And it's true, they can't. There's a fundamental problem in their worldview. What they believe about theology, if they're Catholics, what they believe about authority and tradition, about the hierarchy of the church, the magisterium, about divine revelation, and so on. They contradict all of that when they talk about the natural world. This is also why Catholic men, and Catholic women, I suppose, like to talk about Catholic theology, but they feel very uncomfortable in any practical areas. And this is why the role of the laity has been abandoned in the church. The laity no longer do the work of the laity. They simply meddle idly in theological controversies, which are really none of their business, because their worldview that they've imbibed from this modern scientific philosophy has caused a separation between their Catholic theology and their practical philosophy in all of the practical areas of life. And this is why I say that the confusion in the modern Catholic life is caused by this underlying scientific philosophy that wreaks havoc in the Catholic soul and in the Catholic mind, in the Catholic life. And because Catholics don't study this, they're not conscious of it, they allow this disease to linger and affect everything that they do. And they simply cannot discern its presence within them. And they try to blame the problems on other things. They blame it on the hierarchy of the church. They blame it on the papacy. They blame it on church tradition. They blame it on things that are not the causes of the problem. And they go on handcuffed to the cause of their trouble, which is this modern Baconian, this modern materialistic scientific worldview that came from the scientific revolution. So if we're going to remedy these problems in our lives, if we're going to actually heal ourselves or cure this disease, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to identify the cause. And the cause is not the stuff that modern Catholics are talking about. It's not politics. It's not the doctrine of the church. It's not the hierarchy or authority of the church. These are not the causes of our problems. We can't believe that, well, modern society is just different. It's just bad. It must be the internet. It must be the cell phones. It must be the, fill in the blank with the conspiracy theory or, quick remedy scapegoat product that's proposed each day as the source of our trouble, where this glaring, massive philosophical revolution is left untouched because Catholics aren't even conscious of its presence within them. And this is the problem in modern Catholicism. This is why there are no religious vocations. It's not because there's no spiritual life in the church. It's not because God isn't calling men to religious life. He's already called as many as are willing to follow him in religious life. The reason why Catholics are not choosing to pursue contemplative life or religious life or ministry in the priesthood is because they have been immersed in this materialistic, scientific worldview, and they're not taught the arts and sciences which are the foundation of contemplative life. They're not taught the way of thinking that was taught to the saints throughout history that made them want to live religious lives. They're not taught how to think like that. They're not taught how to pursue the truth by means of prayer and meditation and study. They're raised as materialistic scientists, and materialistic scientists are not going to have any interest in a contemplative life or a religious life. They're not going to be interested in prayer. If you visit, let's say, a Benedictine monastery and find that what these monks do is they pray all day long, modern students are going to say, what good is that? Why don't they do anything? It's because we don't understand the truth. We don't understand the world. We don't understand how things actually work. We've been trained to think in this modern scientific way that was never used as the means of seeking the truth by Christians ever in the history of the church. And Christians simply aren't conscious of this reality in them. So this is the real source of the trouble. Now, what I would like to do is invite Catholics to begin to reflect on these things with me. And there are a number of sources that I'd like us to study together. And I'd like us to make our motto a passage that St. Paul taught in his epistle to the Romans. He said, "Do not be conformed to this world." And that's an important principle. Do not be conformed. If you look at yourself, if you look at the way you think and the way you live, and you ask, where did this come from? This way that I think, this way that I live. Where did this come from? And if the answer is it came from the world, then something's wrong. St. Paul said, do not be conformed to this world. And he said, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I'd like us to make that our motto in these studies of natural philosophy and science and medicine. We have to become conscious of these two different ways of thinking, the way of Catholics and wise men throughout history, and this is not just a Catholic thing, this is why Francis Bacon's attacks on scholastic philosophy are irrational, is because scholastic philosophy is based on pre-Christian Greek philosophy. The Romans thought the way Catholics thought. It wasn't something that Catholics invented. It was the way that wise men always thought about the world and about life. And again, it's a misrepresentation of Catholic thinking to pretend that Catholics made this stuff up. It's in Aristotle, it's in Pliny, it's in Hippocrates, it's in Galen, it's in Ptolemy, the great astronomer. These things were not made up by the Catholic Church. These are ancient philosophical doctrines that were established by many, many demonstrative proofs that you can read in the writings of the great philosophers. Read the Summa Theologica, read St. Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles. You'll see thousands of pages of proofs for these Catholic teachings. This isn't a modern idea, and it's important for us to become conscious that there are two different ways of thinking. And we have to consciously choose which one we're going to follow, to not be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, to actually begin to ask these questions and consider the answers to these questions in light of divine revelation, in light of the testimony of ancient wise men, in light of church tradition. I'd like to ask you to become conscious of your answers to these questions. For example, if you have a headache one day, what's your response to that headache? Do you respond to it with a modern scientific diagnosis? What would St. Thomas Aquinas, living in the 13th century, have thought if he felt a headache coming on? What would Aristotle have thought? What would Cicero or Seneca have thought? What would St. Augustine have thought if he woke up one day or developed a headache? Is it the same thing that a modern person indoctrinated with this modern scientific way of thinking would think about it, or is it a different way of thinking? Would he think something different? I'd like you to become conscious of how you react to physical problems, to pains, to sicknesses, and so on. Do you respond in the way that Catholics responded throughout history? Or do you simply respond the way the world has taught you to respond? And I'm not saying that you necessarily know yet how the ancients or the wise men or saints would have responded, but I'd like you to simply ask, how do you respond, and where did that response come from? Where did you learn to respond in that way? Be conscious of that. And when you respond to something, ask yourself, where am I getting this idea from? Where am I getting this information from? Where is this diagnosis? Where is this remedy coming from? Is this coming from the Creator? Or is this coming from an anti-Catholic worldview that I've simply swallowed up unconsciously throughout the course of my life? Because this will be the beginning of wisdom in this study as we seek to not be conformed to the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And then as we as we go through together, I know you may not have the time to study these works in natural philosophy and medicine and things like that, but I'll go through them in my future talks and introduce you to the principles found in them just for the sake of reflection and try to help you to develop this ancient way of thinking, to become conscious of the different way, the earlier way of thinking about these things, so that you can be conscious of the two different mindsets and know whether you're thinking with the Christian mindset that existed throughout Christian history or with the modern mindset that has come from the world. So that's going to be my goal in these talks on natural philosophy and science and medicine. And I'd like you to, if you're going to take some time to look anything up, just look up Francis Bacon. Go read a Wikipedia article on Francis Bacon, not because Wikipedia is some sort of authoritative source, but it's a good source to just get started with studies. It's a good source to learn about sources. It's a good source to learn about works that are available, works that are published by an author. There's usually helpful links in Wikipedia articles and things like that. But learn a little bit about Francis Bacon. Read about the works that he published and the ideas in those works, and ask yourself, how have these ideas affected my thinking? How have these ideas been drilled into me through my education? And how do these ideas affect my current thinking and living? And are these ideas opposed or in conflict with the ideas that should be directing my thoughts as a Catholic? That's what I'd like you to ask. At this point, I'd like you to simply ask these questions and begin gathering some information. If you find things you find helpful, I'd like you to share them. After all, that's the duty of one who seeks wisdom, is to contemplate and share the fruits of contemplation. So if you find anything interesting, I'd like you to share it. Anything interesting about Francis Bacon, anything interesting about the scientific revolution or the scientific method, things like that. And to close this talk, I'd like to wrap up with just a comment on the church calendar today. It's Tuesday, November 15th, and today is the memorial of St. Albert the Great. And St. Albert the Great lived in the 1200s. He's known as being the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas, but he was an incredible wise man on his own, which is what made him the teacher of St. Thomas in the first place. But he was a man who chose to follow St. Dominic and become a Dominican. And he was a man who worked to understand the true teaching of Aristotle, and he was one of the fathers of scholasticism. Of course, Thomas Aquinas really established scholasticism, but Albert the Great was one of the original influences that helped to establish scholasticism. He was famous because of his interest in natural philosophy. He was interested in the study of the natural world, and this was a part of his Aristotelian foundation. Aristotle wrote books on animals and plants. Aristotle's successor, Theophrastus, wrote a book on plants. The ancient philosophers were very diligent students of the natural world, and that's, again, the reason why this straw man presentation of the ancients is so ridiculous. But Albert the Great was an ancient philosopher. He was interested in the natural world, and he wrote a lot about natural philosophy. And so he's called, in modern circles, he's called the patron saint of scientists. And if you understand what's happened in the world since St. Albert the Great, you know how ridiculous it is to consider a scholastic philosopher, an Aristotelian, to be a patron for men who are thoughtlessly pursuing knowledge of the natural world by means of the senses alone, this modern materialistic, secular, Baconian view of science. St. Albert the Great is certainly not the patron of any such practices in modern science. St. Albert the Great is certainly not a patron of followers of the ideas of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon hated the ideas of St. Albert the Great. Francis Bacon explicitly rejected and led men away from or in opposition to the teachings of men like St. Albert the Great. So to suggest that the modern chemists and physicists and biologists in the universities and Catholic schools are somehow the sons and daughters of St. Albert the Great is simply ignorant. It's not true at all. It would be better to say that St. Albert the Great is the patron saint of natural philosophers, of scholastic, Aristotelian natural philosophers, but not of Baconian modern scientists. So I wanted to make that point since it's St. Albert's feast day today, and for the sake of the truth, I'd like to stand up for St. Albert and argue that he would not be in support of what is done in the name of science today, because he was a Christian man who had no problem uniting faith and reason. He had no problem studying the natural world in light of divine revelation. And this is really the whole point of the Christian sciences. In God's light, we see light. God himself is the light that enlightens our studies in all areas, and all of our studies should be enlightened by faith in divine revelation. So with that, I'll wrap this up. I hope that's a helpful introduction to the problem, and I hope that gets us started and puts us in the right frame of mind to begin this study of natural philosophy and science and medicine in a helpful and productive way, so that we can actually change and improve the way that we think and the way that we live. And hopefully, with God's help, if there are problems that you struggle with, or something that a loved one struggles with, sicknesses or physical troubles, maybe we can develop an understanding to try and remedy those problems that modern science we often will find can't solve or explain, because man is not simply a physical body, but man is what's called a psychosomatic being. He is body and soul united in a way that makes the two of them one and inseparable. Death alone can separate the body and soul. And in every human disease, the soul is involved, and there's no way to treat man just as a collection of material cells, a body of matter. He's a creature composed of body and soul, and the diseases and the physical conditions of man are joined and influenced by both the body and soul. And hopefully we can, through these studies, gain some wisdom and insight into problems you may have, and find Christian remedies, Christian solutions for them based on the wisdom of the ancients. So I hope that that's helpful, and I look forward to continuing these talks in the future and helping you to learn the principles of these ancient natural philosophers and wise men, so that we can think like the saints did think throughout history, that we can not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. God bless.